Esteban, thank you so much for joining us. Whether you're from Princeton or Chicago, formally, we don't care, but we care you're here. So thank you. Go ahead. And John Cochrane, he's driving around the world. Who knows where you are? Someplace observing global warming. So thank you. Go ahead, Esteban.
Okay, so thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. This is, like John said, with José-Luis Cruz, who is here as a student at Princeton. And so the goal of this paper is to build an integrated assessment model to evaluate the effects of global warming. And by that, I mean that it's a particular aspect of the whole phenomenon of climate change, namely the fact that the world is going to get warmer, and that's going to affect both the amenities of people and the productivity of producing in different parts of the world. And so we want to construct such a model. And in order to do so, we want to take into account what we think are some of the crucial or central aspects of this phenomenon. And I'm going to mention three. The first one is that it's a very protracted phenomenon in the sense that it evolves very slowly over many, many years. In fact, hundreds of years. And so the effects are going to be realized dynamically over long periods of time. And this, of course, has been a kind of a very central element of, the discussion on climate change, in the literature and more generally in the policy circles. Then the other crucial aspect is that it's a global externality. Emissions in a particular location very quickly mix in the atmosphere and lead to increases in global temperatures. And so, whatever one particular region does affects the world as a whole. And the third one, which is going to concern us today in particular, is that it has very heterogeneous effects, namely across locations of the world. Namely, those global increases in temperature are going to have implications for local temperatures that are very heterogeneous, that are very different across locations. And in turn, those increases in temperatures in the different locations are going to have different economic effects in those locations, depending on their temperature, for example, but also on their density, the level of income, etc. And so we want to take those three elements into account and build a model that is kind of, in some sense, properly micro-founded, we think, in the sense that, it has agents and firms that are reacting to the phenomenon and have options to react to this phenomenon. A lot of the integrated assessment models out there essentially postulate relationships between global temperatures or temperatures in large regions of the world and output or output growth. We don't want to do that. We want to kind of, build a model that has those behavioral responses in them. And that's important because introducing these behavioral responses implies that we're also introducing ways in which the economy can adapt to this phenomenon. And this, again, is particularly important because if the effects are very heterogeneous across regions, some regions benefit, some regions lose as a result of this, then agents can adapt by changing location, for example, by the world economy can adapt by producing in different parts of the world. And so we want to kind of take that seriously and think about incorporating that form of migration. Of course, migration is costly, and so we're going to incorporate the fact that it is costly, and we're going to introduce other adaptation mechanisms as well. One is trade, so the fact that you can trade in goods across locations of the world that can also help in adapting to climate change. And the third one is innovation. So when we think about this phenomenon, in particular, when we think about the impact that it's going to have 100 years or something, we need to think about a potentially different world, a world that has had the opportunity to to invest in places and develop places that today have not been developed yet. We cannot take the static view that the world is just going to look like it looks today, because of course, in 100 years, there's plenty of room to develop areas of the world that have not been developed yet. And so we want to also bring this into the model. Now, given that this is a relatively short talk, I'm not going to go into the details of the model. I'm not going to give you kind of a mathematical description of the model. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to describe the basic elements of the model in this diagram, and then give you a sense of kind of what is it that we're adding in this paper or in this analysis relative to the efforts that I've done in other work and others have done in their own work. And so, the core economic model comes from a paper I have with Klaus Desmet and David Nagy in 2018 that presents like a spatial model of growth. So this is a model in which there's many regions in the world. So the world geography is, looks as the real world. I'll show you many maps in a moment. And agents live in a particular location. They work in that particular location. And there's a land in that location, and there's firms producing. These firms hire that land, hire people, and they produce particular goods. And these firms have the option to innovate, to improve their technology by investing in the location. And if they do so, then the location's technology increases, which implies that in the future you can produce more in that location. And so that is going to imply that this is going to be a growth model in the sense that different locations are going to invest, or firms in those locations are going to invest in this technology. And so the technology is going to evolve over time. That, of course, is going to affect the wages of individuals. It's going to attract individuals to go to locations that have invested and where technology is particularly good. And it's also going to affect the rents in those locations, how the price of land in those locations. Together, those wages, together with the prices in that location, which are going to also be determined by the geography, where that location is relative to the world, and therefore how easy it is to, buy goods from other locations, together with the amenities of the location, which are going to summarize how attractive that location is as a place to live, are going to motivate agents to be in a particular, or to live in a particular region. And so, every period, these agents are going to have the option to move potentially to some other region. If they decide to do so, they can subject to mobility costs. Okay, so that's kind of the core of the model that we're going to use. To that basic core model, we're going to add a few things in this analysis. The first is that we're going to incorporate energy as a factor of production. And this energy can be produced using two types of fuels, if you will, or two types of forms of producing energy. One is clean, and the other is fossil fuels. And those are going to be combined using a CES production function that then is going to lead to energy, which is what's used in the standard production process.
Could I ask just a quick clarifying question?
Of course.
So sort of, at the very basic level of the model, how in your model is temperature bad? I ask this because
I'll get there. That's exactly
is moving to the southwest where it's hotter than it is in the northeast.
Yeah. It's not. Well, it's not necessarily. I'll show it to you in a second. I'm going there. Exactly there. So just give me 1 minute. And so you generate fossil fuels that leads to CO2 emissions. Those CO2 emissions increase the CO2 stock of carbon in the atmosphere through carbon cycle. We're gonna borrow from the scientists all of this. So this is perfectly standard. That leads to increases in global temperatures. These global increase in global temperature in turn translate through using a downscaling model that I'll describe in a second into local temperatures. And John, this is the answer to your question. These local temperatures then are going to affect three things, or potentially going to affect three things, and we're going to estimate this relationship. They can affect local productivities, and they're going to affect these productivities differently depending on, you know, how warm these areas are, etc., which is, I think, what you were referring to. They can affect amenities, how, you know, how attractive those areas are to live. So if you're in the Sahara, you know, and it gets warmer, that's obviously not nice to live there. And they can affect natality rates, or so birth rates minus mortality rates in those locations, because there's some evidence that temperature can affect mortality rates as well. Okay, so those are the three ways in which we're going to allow local temperatures to affect, you know, the fundamentals in a particular location. We're going to take this model, we're going to quantify it at the 1 degree by 1 degree level of the world. So there's about 23,000 cells, 1 degree by 1 degree cells that have some land in them in the world. And so that's the level of resolution that we're going to be using. The baseline year is going to be year 2000, because that's the first year where we have, or well, it's actually the second cross-section for which we have these GECON data that at this level of resolution that Nordhaus has put together. And as is standard in these models, what we're going to do is you can take the model, take data on income and population at the cell level. And what you can do is you can, the model gives you a mapping from fundamental amenities and fundamental productivities into these population levels and income levels conditional on the migration cost. And so you have that mapping. And so what you can do is you can invert that mapping. And you can show that the inversion is unique. And so that means that you can, you know, calculate what are the amenities and productivities that are exactly consistent with the levels of population and income in the world. And so that's going to be what we're going to do in the baseline year. And then you can let the model run and see, well, what are the changes in population produced by this model? And you can compare those with what has happened in the world, say, between 2000 and 2005. And you can say, well, are the flows correct or not? Are people moving as they are, in fact, moving in the world? And you can adjust mobility costs so that in such a way that you exactly match net migration flows in the world, or net migration changes in the world. And so that gives us the migration cost. And then the last part is trade, the trade cost. And you can essentially adjust trade costs so that the model satisfies the gravity equation, which we know is a very good description of trade flows across locations in the world. So that's, you know, in a nutshell, the model that I'm gonna show you.
So just a quick question. What's endogenous, what's exogenous? In the time, you mentioned 23,000 cells, but what's the time frame? I know it's long, but just so structurally, how do we think about what the inputs are, what the outputs, et cetera?
So productivities are endogenous because there's the investment process and temperature can affect them. Amenities are endogenous because temperature can affect them. But at a given point in time, there's a level of those things that can be changed through investment and can be changed through temperature. And that's the evolution that we're going to follow over time.
Esteban, about that, maybe you can clarify. So the clean and the fossil fuels are, I could imagine them coming from innovation and research and production. You need to produce and maybe pollute somewhat in order to develop this clean, or is it just exogenous supply of clean? How do you think about that?
Well, there's going to be a technology to produce those things, both clean and fossil fuels. If you use fossil fuels, you pollute, right? If you use clean, you don't pollute. and there's an elasticity of substitution between the two in order to produce energy. That elasticity of substitution for now will take as given and fixed over time. And now the technology to, just to finish that thought, the technology to produce those two types of energy, we're gonna incorporate changes in the evolution of that technology that essentially are gonna follow the world technology frontier that evolves according to these endogenous investments that I described before.
Okay, I think I got that. And the other related question is whether trade, since you mentioned so much trade, the role of trade in clean and because fossil fuels come from the Middle East and so on, and
yes, so we're going to take into account, the extent to which different places have different prices for the different fossil fuels, but and so that's going to determine the extent to which, when they produce goods, they use one type of energy versus another. So we will use that. But we're gonna, fall a little bit short in terms of describing the full energy market and the flows of energy and words like pipelines, and therefore, oil is a little bit cheaper than in other places. We're essentially trying to match the share of each type of energy in each location. And so that's going to give us the relative technologies for the two types of energies in every location.
How are you going to handle the problem of endogenous technological change in the energy area? And most of the energy modelers I know really have no idea of how empirically they can get endogenous technical change, and particularly because we've had inventions of different types of energy over time that people didn't envision ahead of time. How are you planning on getting a relationship there?
Okay, important. We're gonna do it in a perhaps less than completely satisfactory way. There's innovation, there's endogenous innovation in the model for the production of goods, not for the production of energy. The technology to produce the two different types of energy is gonna follow that technological frontier of the world that is evolving endogenously, but is as if this energy sector is borrowing from the innovations that are happening in the rest of the economy. And the extent to which you borrow or not, that elasticity is we're gonna calibrate such that the trend in the share of both types of energy, so that we match the trend in the share of both types of energy. So that's in a nutshell what we're gonna do. Now, of course, you can say, well, I want you to model directly innovation in that sector. I think that can be done. We haven't fully done it that way.
A first order issue here is what happens to the population. If Chad is right that the population is going to dwindle down to one person, this becomes not quite as big an issue. Is there a population?
There's going to be local population growth that is going to depend both on income and on temperature. And so there's like a Beckerian quality quantity trade-off at the local level, plus the effect on mortality of it. And so that's gonna generate population growth. Like an evolution of population, also absent climate change that follows the UN predictions roughly. I can show you the extent to which it does. And then, we can try to understand what are the implications of global warming in particular for population growth and for the level of population. And what we find is that they are relatively small, about, with or without maybe 30 million people difference. So it's tiny. What it can be much more important though, is if you affect, if in order to deal with this issue, you affect, say, migration costs or trade costs, that because it affects income more, it can have a bigger effect on total population. So
the population projections you're talking about have been wildly overstated population growth in.
So I'll show you. So maybe we need to scale that back a little bit. I'll show you the path. The path I think goes to I'm gonna say 10 billion. I'll show you the path. It's 10 billion and then it comes down a bit. We're gonna do so such that at the end of the day, if you get very rich, eventually you converge to zero population. So kind of in the long run, it stabilizes.
So you don't have any shrinkage? Is that what you, is zero growth?
There's growth first and then some shrinkage.
So
but first it grows. So,
first it grows, and then
relative to today, population stabilizes at 9 billion rather than 7. Okay, so like I said, there's a level of global temperature that is affected by the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And given that level of global temperature, then there is an effect on local temperatures. And that's what's called local temperature downscaling, that, you know, scientists have told us that, you know, it follows, or this is a reasonable model of that with a local GR that we need to estimate based on the characteristics of the location. And so here's a map to show you how heterogeneous these effects are. So, by the way, the pixels in this map, that's the level of resolution that we have in the model, right? So that's the level of the analysis. And what you see here is, this is in some sense the elasticity of the increase, in temperatures, in local temperatures, as a result of the increase of one degree Celsius in global temperature. So if global temperatures increase by 1 degree Celsius, in areas here in Siberia, the temperatures are actually increased by 2 degrees Celsius or a little bit more. On the contrary, in Central America here, if temperatures in the world increase by 1 degree Celsius, temperatures actually in Central America only increase by about half a degree Celsius. So you see the vast heterogeneity, and this is kind of a thing, you know, people have mentioned this before. Say in the US, what you see is there's some variation within the US in terms of like the extent to which global temperatures are going to affect local areas.
This looks like spectacular news. We get all of Siberia and Alaska and probably Greenland to farm and build houses on, and things don't get that bad anywhere else.
It's old news. Yes, I agree.
Sorry, it's news to me. Great, thanks. I'll go drive around.
Unless the melting of the permafrost releases a lot of methane.
Yeah, right.
Right. So there's of course the effect that process that you described, John, may have on emissions and therefore on the speed of global temperature increase. But the fact that an increase of 1 degree Celsius has very differential effects across regions in the world, that's very well recognized and used in many of the models out there.
So I have a quick question. The one thing that sort of jumps at me by looking at the map is the difference between the North and the South Island in New Zealand. And it seems to me that that could be, if you can explain that to me in an intuitive way, that would be a great way to understand the whole map. They're not that far away, and they are very different in color, right? Adjacent to each other, but different. And
well, adjacent to it, I mean,
but that surprises me. I mean, if you look at South America, the cone, it's very gradual the way the colors change, and yes, it's discrete. Well, if you may not have the answer, Esteban. So
I don't know. I know. I mean, you know, it depends on all these different things. And so, you know, it's, I don't.
So I mean, if you can get a narrative, a story for that, I think that would be very.
But just to be clear, I think that's an interesting narrative to have, and I don't have one particularly for New Zealand. We should get one, but you know, this is in some sense the starting point of what we do, right? I mean, this is the science that then goes into the economic model that we have, right? That's the underlying change that we're going to bring into the model based on
the answer is very different wind patterns in North and South Island and New Zealand. It's about where the jet stream tends to go.
No, they make red wine on the North Island and white.
Okay. Let me keep going. So, okay, so we have this model, right? And then what we can do, like I described, we can take data on population and income. And from that data, we can uncover these levels of productivity and amenities in the different locations of the world, conditional on this mobility cost, like I said, but then in turn, we can calculate from mobility patterns. Now, we can do that for different years for which we have data at this level of disaggregation. And the particular years that we're gonna do it for 4 years for which we have this data, so over a 20-year period. And so that's gonna give us a panel at this level of resolution of these amenities and productivities. And then we're gonna estimate these damage functions that tell us what's the semi-elasticity of increases in local temperatures on these two things, amenities and productivity. Where this elasticity is going to vary by the local temperature, and we're going to have a local fixed effect. We're going to have some local trends as well at a slightly higher level of aggregation. And so that's going to give us these two, the graphs that you see below. The left one is for amenities, the right one for productivities. The x-axis are winter temperatures, so temperatures in January in the southern hemisphere, in the northern hemisphere, and July in the southern hemisphere. And so if you're you're some of the one of the coldest places in the world, then an increase of 1 degree Celsius in that location increases amenities by about 2.5%. That's what this graph is telling you, right? And so as temperatures get warmer, the level of temperatures get warmer, that effect goes down and, you know, eventually reverses sign. And so in the hottest places in the world, the effect on amenities is negative. So 1 degree Celsius increase in those places implies lower amenities by about the same amount. It's roughly symmetric. And the right-hand side is the same thing for productivity. Those effects are a little bit larger. So it's about 8 to 9% for the coldest places, and about 12, 13% for the warmest places in the world. Now, as you can see,
what does amenity mean?
Amenities are these summary of how attractive it is to live in that place. So it's a component of your utility that you get if you live in that area. And essentially the model measures that by the standard exercise to have in your mind is think about places that have a lot of people, but low real wages, right? So those places conditional on mobility cost would be places that have high amenities.
But you have fixed effects in here, right? So this identification comes entirely off of changes over time. This just, we're looking at the productivity slowdown here?
Well, I mean, these are, no, well, changes in temperature over time, yeah.
Yeah. So you're just looking at differentials of where...
I mean, it's not fully, I mean, that statement is partially right. I mean, in the sense that the time trends that we're incorporating, I mean, we're incorporating some time trends and some location fixed effects is not depending on what particular estimation we're talking about, they are not exactly at the same level of resolution. So there's some cross-sectional variation there too.
This is, of course, the most important assumption in the whole thing. And to what extent does temperature affect productivity and amenities in a modern industrial economy? You look across seasons where temperature changes by 40 degrees. You look across regions of the US, you see stuff that's 100 times bigger than global warming, and no obvious sign that a modern industrial economy cares one whit about the temperature. You look historically, and all the little ice ages were famines and disasters. Actually, 10,000 years ago was the best thing that ever happened to human beings. So,
well, the medieval warming period actually changed the world in very important ways, right? Created the whole Mongol Empire. So that was a couple of degrees. So I don't know. I'm telling you how I'm doing it, right? It's a particular way of doing it. It's I'm estimating this equation based on this time variation, right? And it's kind of a very specific methodology to get it. I have no agenda to get it positive, large or small. But one of the things that you do, let me just describe one thing. One of the things that you do get is that, in the extreme places, coming back to your point, John, about, the differences in the US, etc. In the extreme places, you get clearly significant effects of the effects of temperature. In this intermediate range, right? We don't know. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what is the optimal temperature there and how flat or not this curve is there. So the range of potential optimal temperatures, or where you cannot reject zero, is relatively wide.
So we're economists. This is supposed to be about the economics of it. The fact here seems to be that Norway, Sweden, and Alaska grew pretty well, and a lot of the hot Middle East had civil wars and was a disastrous place recently.
No, we have more fixed effects than that. I mean, that is these ones here at the 2x2 level. So 2 squares by 2 squares. So that's 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers. And these are local, these are the 1 degree by 1 degree with different types of soil characteristics and local production.
We're economists. When we think about other things that are or are not held constant, we want to think about what is there about productivity that makes it harder when it's hotter and colder, but doesn't seem to make it harder to move a plant from Detroit down to Florida. So, just to have
but just to be clear, this is not the final effect on output or anything, right? This is the effect on productivity. And then, on top of that, there's, the economy is operating. So the whole, and in some sense, one of the beauties that we think of what we're doing is that you're using them all to take all of the actual, the fact that if one place is a little bit more productive, it also attracts more resources, etc. That's all, in some sense, taken care of by the structure of the model that we're taking out in order to calculate these levels of productivity, right? So, anyway, and we're matching, and the model is kind of matching the levels of output across locations exactly right? So it's not, in that sense.
You're not matching seasonals in output across locations exactly.
It's not seasonal, it's yearly.
Okay. Well, if it's so hard to produce when it's hot, anyway, go ahead.
Well, but I mean, there's optimization on that, of course, right? But anyway, so that's, I think one part of this discussion I think is important to keep in mind, and I tend to emphasize, is exactly this, right? I mean, given the variation that we've seen so far, it's not that easy to estimate, exactly kind of those optimal temperatures in the mildest regions in the world. It's a little bit easier to establish the range, but not the level exactly. Okay, and so I'll come back to that later on.
Esteban, just to understand, the one concern I imagine is that these effects depend themselves on the technological innovation. That is, we have a certain technology because these are the average temperatures, and if we lived in a world with higher temperatures, we had different technologies or different ways of delivering amenity. So they don't necessarily have to be constant. And we're going to extrapolate of this sort of very local.
You mean in terms of like you can have technology to adapt to temperature? That's the point that you're making.
I guess, yeah. And what we're observing is that if a cold place gets a little warmer, then it gets better. But if it was always warmer, it might not gain that effect forever.
It could be. So the effect that we have here is that depending on the local temperature and where the place is in the world, you're gonna invest in that location, or firms there are gonna invest a particular amount in that location, and that's gonna enhance production in that location. It's not gonna directly be because they are adapting to weather, they are reacting to the temperature and investing optimally, conditional on that temperature. That's the part that we're incorporating.
Got it.
Now, can you incorporate another effect, which is the investment process itself is affected by temperature, for example, because of the type of mechanisms that you were describing? Probably you can. Quantifying that would require some thoughts, and we don't really know how to do that well yet.
Esteban, can I ask another question about the logistic, the log productivity shape? I realized I was missing something. I would have thought it was hump shaped. I would have thought that, you know, there's an ideal temperature, and if you're really, really cold, like it looks like this says
no, this is that
Antarctica and Alaska are the most productive places.
No. This is the effect of so the way to interpret this is the semi-elasticity of a change in temperature. So if temperatures grow by 1 degree, by how much do amenities change? Right. That's a interpret.
Starting from.
So it's exactly what you're saying. It's exactly what you're saying. It is U-shaped. So the fact that this is positive and then goes down means that, you know, very cold temperatures, you're not productive, then there's an optimal temperature, and then you come down. And that's exactly what I was saying before. When it crosses zero, that's where that curve that you're thinking about is at its max, but we don't really know exactly where that zero is because the confidence intervals are very wide there. That was exactly
these are the slopes, not the levels, is the way to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, so another part that I have mentioned that is kind of important for some of the policy implications is that the cost of extracting fossil fuels increases the more you extract. So in some sense, you have to go deeper to get them, and so people have estimated that cost. And so we're going to try to match that. And this is going to matter because if you then, for example, put a carbon tax in this model, what it does is it delays, or so it's, you know, it makes people substitute towards clean energy, of course. But then what that means is that they consume less fossil fuels, and so you move less up this curve, which implies that in the future, fossil fuels are actually going to be a little bit cheaper as a result, because you're not moving up the cost curve. And so this effect is going to be important when I show you this. Okay, so let me show you some results
before you go on to that, Esteban. Most of the research that I've seen on cost of extraction has technological advances very, very important. You have the depletion effect in there. But for example, in natural gas, the revolution in fracking for natural gas, 3D seismic and so forth, has reduced the cost of the extraction, actually probably faster than the depletion effect has increased it. So you just have the depletion rather than the time-dependent technology.
You're
change?
right. You're right, but let me just clarify one thing. You're right, but this is, so we're gonna have that technological evolution that I was explaining before, that is gonna follow the technological frontier in the world there anyway, right? On top of that, you have this curve, and then so you have like a technological race between both types of technology plus this effect. And so it's really the relative effect, of the improvement in fossil fuel technology, given that you have this curve underlying it, relative to the evolution of the technology of clean energy, which is also, of course, evolving. So it's about the race between the two, right? It's not just the level.
So you just put one of the dimensions on there, not the other dimension.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So let me show you some of the outcomes that this generates. Okay. So what I'm gonna show you is this is the evolution of the world economy over 4 centuries. So starting in 2000, as I said, that's how kind of the baseline year. And this is the baseline scenario that we're gonna use. And this baseline scenario is kind of the carbon cycle is calibrated using the IPCC numbers that vary by depending on how the different scenarios that have different severities. We're gonna use the more severe one, the RCP 8.5. And so the dashed line here is what they generate. The green line is what our model generates. So you can see that we kind of get exactly the same type of increase in CO2 emissions. We kind of go a little bit higher than them. They essentially, from here on, they have an exogenous phenomenon where they say, well, eventually the emissions stop, and then there's an abatement technology and they go down. We have them go down exactly because of this increasing in the cost of carbon over time. That generates temperatures increases on top of kind of above the pre-industrial level that can go all the way up by 7 degrees in 200 years. And you can see that the curve is very similar to the one they generate for the IPCC has generated for that scenario. But of course, here, the whole economy, everything is endogenous. The whole economy is operating in order to generate these increases in temperature. Okay.
Just a clarifying question. So in this one, you're just holding constant the technology for alternatives. So the only reason people switch to clean fuel is because the price of carbon fuel is going up. Is that correct?
No, both are evolving. Both technologies are evolving. And in fact, the clean technology is evolving a little bit faster so that we match the evolution of the shares of both types of energy over the last couple of decades.
Okay, so we keep going kind of on the trend of relative cost.
Yeah, plus there's that convex curve cost that I showed you, which increases the price of carbon the more you extract, right? And doesn't allow you to extract in some sense too much because there's also, there's only
so much,
so much, right? Okay.
So, Esteban, I have a question. Are you going to show us the evolution of the migration cost, the cost of moving? Because it seems to me that that's what closes the model. You said you invert the matrix, then you follow whether the model tracks.
So migration costs, just to stop you right, migration costs are going to be fixed.
Moving, didn't you say that you're going to change moving costs so that the model actually tracks what happened?
So we're going to do that over the period where we have data. And that's going to give us this local level of migration costs, and then we're going to fix those. We can do comparative statics, and I'm going to show you some exercises in which we change those. We can change those, but the baseline exercise just has the cost of moving across locations that we, in some sense, calibrate that way and fix them.
I get it. Are you going to show us the cost that you use in the final calibration? Because it seems to me, I mean, you said that you move them around.
I don't think I have them here. I don't think I have them here, but they are definitely in the paper. Yeah.
And what do you compare them with? I mean, what is the empirical, observable counterpart to that particular variable?
Net population changes over that period.
Okay. So just net population is what you take as the cost of moving.
Yeah, whatever makes the model match the changes in population at the local level, that's my migration cost. It includes everything that stops people from going to certain places.
Okay.
So it's like a wedge in the as people using.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so these are the effects on amenities and productivities in 2200 across the different parts of the world. So you can see what I guess you would expect, which is big effects, positive effects in the northern latitudes, negative effects on amenities in South America and Africa, particularly in productivity. You have kind of a wider range that goes to India, Southeast Asia, parts of Central America. One interesting thing about this graph that is going to come back is look at the rich world, right? So the rich world is all in these latitudes, right? Which is the US, Europe, Japan, etc. It's all kind of concentrated in these latitudes, and these latitudes are really not that affected at the end either in terms of amenities or in terms of productivity. There's some range in the US that we were discussing and in other places, but they are right at the cusp of places that win and places that lose. And so that, of course, is gonna affect the implications for the welfare implications for those locations.
Okay. Am I misreading the graph? Or it looks like everybody wins, just some by more and some by less. The numbers are all positive.
One means you stay the same.
Oh, okay. Okay, so this
is relative. So sorry, I should have explained it better. This is relative to no warming. So what is the productivity if there is global warming relative to a contrafactual scenario where we shut it down?
And does 2 mean 100% more, or does it mean 2% more?
2 means 100% higher productivity than what you would have otherwise in 200 years.
And 0 means no productivity at all.
Yeah. But remember, part of the productivity effect is endogenous, right? Temperatures are better, and so firms go and invest in those locations, right?
Ah, got it. So, right. So
it's not purely from the damage function that I showed you. Okay. So and this is the effect that I was talking about before with Bob on global population. So this is the global population evolution that the model produces. This is the range of projections by the UN. So we're kind of there in the range, and this is what I was mentioning before. Populations go up and then kind of stabilize, come down and stabilize as the world gets richer. And then you cannot really see the effect of global warming there. I mean, because both curves are very close. That's simply because there's not a lot of, like, the effect on total population is relatively small. The map on the right, this is the effect on mobility. So people move to the northern latitudes, they leave these places, but the northern latitudes are relatively, unpopulated, they're not densely populated. And so that means that, 60% more population there also doesn't mean like huge migrations. About 6% of the world population will be in a different location according to this. That amounts to about 600 million people changing location as a result of global warming. And that all ends up into, affecting welfare. And this is kind of the effect on welfare, baseline effect on welfare. You can have about 15% losses in welfare. This is the welfare of an individual that lives in that location today, how that's affected, take into account, all the possibilities of moving, etc. And so these areas are going to lose about 15%. Some of the northern areas can win about 15%. The rich world essentially loses just very little, but is the poorest areas in the world today that are particularly affected, all those blue areas that you see in the map. This is the distribution. And so you can see that the distribution is exactly two model, right? I mean, it has two peaks. This is the rich world peak that essentially is not affected. and then you have the poor world peak that it loses quite a bit. Okay.
And people don't move just because it's costly to move.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. I mean, that seems like almost, when you put it like that, that seems almost tautological, no?
I guess it depends on the nature of the cost.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes to that. Yeah, people don't move because they are. It's costly to move. But obviously, you know, it's all a balance between the real wages. There's effects on the price index. There's effects on wages. There's effects on the amenities, and there's the mobility.
But so
right?
people
all of that put together.
Is the cost? So people can move. You can move within the U.S. If you move 200 miles, you've way outdone any effects of global warming. So I would think the ability to move 100 miles wouldn't be that costly.
Yeah, within the U.S. I mean, but there's cost of moving within the U.S. as well. I mean, so
yeah, but so is that
they're not setting those to zero, right?
So I'm sorry, is the cost just to move across countries, or is it linear in distance, or what's the cost of moving?
The cost is, the way the cost is modeled is there's an origin and a destination effect. It's log linear in the origin and destination effect, and we're getting those, the origin and destination effects, such that the model matches the evolution of net population between 2000 and 2005. So the model gets exactly right? The total change in population in each cell over this period. That's the way we're getting the mobility cost. Okay, so because these amenity adjusted real wages do not equalize across regions in the US, that has to imply that there's also variation in the mobility costs within the US. Okay.
Esteban, I was just wondering if the levels are very different across locations. So the percentages, you could, instead of moving people, just transfer money. And let's say the US gains 1%, and that's enough to compensate Argentina for any loss. But is there, what are the gains from trade, I guess?
The average effect on the world is 6%.
That is just taking an like population weighted average.
Welfare. I mean, you can calculate also the effect on real GDP, population weighted average, yes. You can calculate the effect on real GDP, that is similar in magnitude.
So it's as if everyone lost 5.5%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But big distribution.
Big distribution, right? But there's no gains like you mitigate it by reallocating. Okay.
Right. I mean, we don't have transfer systems. I mean, of course, you could have transfer systems, but we're not implementing those. Right? Okay. So remember, when I was responding to Chad's comment and some of John's comments, I was saying, look, we don't really know exactly where that max is. And so that implies that we don't really know where the level of that damage function is, or there's some, the confidence interval is relatively large there. And that of course implies that when we look at that total cost that I was just talking about, we're very uncertain about what that is. And so here, this reflects that uncertainty. So think about 2200. This is the 95 or 95 confidence intervals, which of course is huge. Those are based on those damage functions that I discussed before. The level effect is about 9% in terms of welfare, but we're pretty sure that we're not going to gain in terms of the world, but we don't know if we're going to lose essentially 0 or 20%. So that's the 95 confidence interval.
Where's the uncertainty coming? Where's the uncertainty here? How are you measuring this?
Coming from the errors that we get in the estimation of those two damage functions that I showed. Okay. That's where the confidence intervals.
So by the way, you have about 20 minutes left, so make sure you get to the end. And
yes.
Questions are great. Okay.
It's good for me, but I mean, if you want me to stop and just take questions,
no, we want to hear your ending.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so so we're very certain about the level, as I just showed you. These confidence intervals are fairly wide, but at the same time, we kind of know something about the range of these effects, this minus 15 to plus 15, right? And so, the curve shifts up and down, but the range is not that affected. And so, we know that there's going to be, this 25% gap in the effects between the areas that are going to be the most affected and the areas that are going to be the least affected. It's not exactly, the distribution is not simply shifted, it's more complex than that, but the range stays more or less the same. So that we're more certain about. Now, okay, so let me, go.
Esteban, this remains couch change relative to 2 centuries of economic growth or to the uncertainties involved. If I get 2% plus or minus 0.1% of growth, I just wipe this out.
It is what it is. I agree. I mean,
so one could present GDP versus.
Well, I mean, 30% difference in the impact on some locations relative to others is not peanuts.
You're getting somewhere.
6% overall for the world compared to other.
That's 3 years of growth. One big recession.
I agree with that. But But the effects on inequality are much more substantial.
Residential zoning costs us 20% of GDP in Leo Hammond's latest estimate.
Okay, maybe. But I think residential zoning actually costs us quite a bit. But these effects on inequality are quite big. I mean, I don't, show me the policies that create these numbers. It's not that easy.
I got 2 centuries of growth to get you to.
No, this is present discounted value. I'm giving you the present discounted value of the effects, like the welfare today, kind of the impact on welfare today over time, right? It's not, I mean, if I look at this in 200 years, those effects are larger, of course, right?
Chad can do that in his sleep. Okay, go ahead.
So, I mean, it's here, right? I mean, this is the curve, yeah. Anyway, okay, so there's part of the reason that these effects are what they are. I mean, I show you the damage functions, and we discussed that they're not giving you small effects, but part of the reason is that there's adaptation, right? So people are adapting, and one of the ways in which they're adapting is through migration. So what this exercise does is it increases migration costs to try to gauge that, and so by either 12.5% or 25%, there's 2 exercises here. And what this shows is that, if you increase the migration cost uniformly by 25% in the world, the effect of climate change is about 1/3 larger. So that's a relatively kind of large effect of climate change. Here is the diff and diff. So the effect of climate change with and without the increase in migration costs, or without minus with the effect of migration costs. So everything that is red are the areas that are worse off if you increase migration costs, or are better off if you don't. And so, obviously the northern latitudes are worse off if you increase migration costs because they're benefiting from people going there. Surprisingly, perhaps India, China, and parts of Africa are not, because they actually benefit from the fact that people can migrate out to other places when climate change happens. And otherwise, they get poorer, population there increases, congestion costs kick in, and that's bad for these regions. In kind of different story, you have a different story for Australia or for parts of South America that are less densely populated. And so what they want is to retain some of the population so that they have critical mass to invest, for firms to have an incentive to invest in technology there. And so for them, it's actually positive, though the effects on climate change become smaller when you increase migration costs. So it really kind of depends on the particular area that we're talking about. The effects on trade in this model are relatively small. So increasing trade costs has very small impact. And the main reason is that the climate shock, if you want to think about it that way, is very spatially correlated, as is trade. So you trade a lot with the locations that are close by, but the locations that are close by are almost as affected as you. And so, you know, trade is a bad adaptation mechanism in that sense. And so that leads to small effects. We don't have sectoral effects or differential sectoral effects of temperature here. In other words, we've incorporated those, and then you get a somewhat bigger role for trade. And the final effect is on innovation. So innovation, you know, if you increase the cost of innovation, you hurt the northern regions. Because of course, the whole point is that those develop because you can invest in them and you can create new city there, etc. when temperatures go up, and you kind of benefit these other regions. Now, overall for the world, right, the effects of climate change are actually a little bit smaller when you when the cost of innovation increase. And the reason is that when the cost of innovations are small, in the absence of climate change, if we kind of set climate change aside for a second, the world economy, production in the world economy is over time concentrating in India and China anyway, right? But these are places that are going to be hammered by climate change. And so if you stop that from happening by increasing innovation costs, and that actually reduces the overall cost of climate change. So those effects kind of are really about the geography or the details of the geography of the world. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but let me spend a few minutes on policy before I finish, and we can have a few minutes for the discussion. So you know, one thing, I cannot solve for the optimal policy in this framework because I can solve for an equilibrium, but I cannot solve for the optimal allocation. And so what I'm left with is trying different policies. And so the policies that I'm going to try are a carbon tax with some abatement technology, and then clean energy subsidies. Carbon tax is obviously a very well-known policy that, you know, is typically advocated by economists, or in many circles, you know, that seems like the obvious answer, or people talk about it as if it's the obvious answer to this. And so, you know, what happens here if you impose, so what we're going to do is we're going to impose a carbon tax, kind of Swedish level carbon tax that would be a 200% carbon tax in this framework. And we're going to do it uniformly across locations, you know, locally rebated to agents there. And so you see the effect on CO2 emissions. Obviously, CO2 emissions go down. And so that decreases CO2 emissions for a long time, right? But eventually, you know, you don't move up that convex curve that I was talking about before. And so what that means is that there's, you know, that curve in some sense eliminates the effect of the tax, right? Because as you consume less of it, the cost doesn't go up. And so that cancels out the tax. And so eventually, right, the price of carbon with the tax is actually lower than what it would be with the tax. And so the effect reverses. And so what it does is essentially it delays the consumption of carbon, right? That's the main effect of the tax. It delays the consumption of carbon. That's what you see in the graph on the left. And that has an effect, of course, on temperatures. It essentially flattens the temperature curve. To use a common analogy now, I guess, you flatten the temperature curve. You reduce temperatures for a long time. You don't really reduce temperatures kind of far into the future. And so the benefit of the tax is really just to, you know, to temporarily decrease temperatures. And that you can do. You can do pretty, you can reduce temperatures by about 2 or 3 degrees. Now that of course has a big negative effect on the economy today, but it has a positive effect over time because it has a positive effect on growth through its effect on temperature. So eventually you gain from it. So one is, even. And so these are losses, these are gains in percentage terms. In real GDP, you see the effects on welfare there. And so, current losses, future gains, it all depends on how you discount. And so, whether, how do you value or how do you evaluate the losses of people today relative to the effects on people in the future, conditional on the fact that this economy is growing too. So future individuals are also going to be richer, right? And so, that limits kind of the extent to which we can increase the discount factor. But like the table here shows, whether this is a good policy or not, and what's the optimal level of the carbon tax in this framework, crucially depends on the discount factor, which is of course a point that others have made. But here is particularly salient because you have this effect of delaying rather than eliminating. Yeah.
Bob Hall has a quick question. Bob?
Okay, so this is incredibly detailed. And I just wonder if you've done any work to justify the complication. So Bill Nordhaus's model runs comfortably on your Apple Watch and gives interesting answers. So is the amount of, and you presumably have to run on a supercomputer. So I just wonder what's the payoff to,
I think
it seems like a lot of these things, the uncertainty is so large that you think that applying all this detail in such an uncertain environment probably isn't as valuable as it would be in a more certain environment.
I think the answer to that is really kind of this discussion that we were having with John, which is, there is the aggregate effects, and then there is the distribution of local effects, and the big ones is the distribution of local effects. Nordhaus has nothing to say about that, and the models that he has put forward don't have anything to say about that, and we do. And now, and I can go further. I can argue that in some sense, these numbers, even at the aggregate level, are interesting numbers because they incorporate adaptation mechanisms that the type of other assessment models, kind of aggregate assessment models, don't have, and therefore take into account, these mobility patterns, etc. Namely that wide heterogeneity, how agents are using that wide heterogeneity. And that interacts very heavily with policy, as I showed you, with changes in the different types of costs. So that's the point that I was making before. These adaptation mechanisms matter, and they matter very differently across different parts of the world. So that's the hope, right? That those differences and highlighting how this is going to impact different parts of the world and how policy is going to impact different parts of the world is interesting enough to do this analysis.
Now, another point I want to insert somehow is the right way to think about uncertainty is to weight the different outcomes by marginal utility in that outcome. So it's not a question of discounting over time. It's a question of incorporating the fact that people care more about output when the output is scarce and marginal utility is high.
Yes.
Anyone in this science pay attention to marginal utility?
Yeah.
I think I saw.
We can do that. We can do that for sure.
Well, let me just follow on, Bob. You didn't put in any uncertainty about the time path of global warming. Your uncertainty was about your estimates of a fixed global warming. But if the IPCC model has it wrong and we go by 10 degrees or by 2 degrees, that's going to be a bigger effect, which will then affect global GDP and then the marginal utility effect.
True. So these agents are not facing, I mean, there's perfect foresight for these agents.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that just because they know that their marginal utility is high doesn't reduce the amount that they're harmed by.
So you can still do like Ramsey discounting or something. Yeah, absolutely.
But that's time. I think that in lots of policy areas, people confuse time discounting with what finance teaches us, which is to discount by marginal utility.
I agree.
That shows up in climate modeling by suppose global growth is much better than we think, then we're likely to have worse climate effects. But guess what? We're really rich. And if global growth is much worse than we think, well, then the climate effects aren't so bad either. And that pushes up the discount rate a lot.
So that's very salient. I mean, that type of effect is very, so if you, one of the effects of, when you reduce migration frictions or when you reduce trade frictions, that grows the economy, makes climate change worse, but of course grows the economy. I mean, so you have a lot of these effects. I mean, you can exactly evaluate, these different type of effects. Now you can introduce, randomness in terms of these paths and have like a stochastic temperature model in principle.
Yeah, make the aggregate productivity a little bit uncertain. And I think that would.
You can do that.
So Esteban, you just have a couple minutes so wanted you to finish off and.
Okay, so let me just say a couple of more things. So you flatten the temperature curve. That's what I told you the carbon tax does, and so that's particularly good if the cure is coming. And so if an abatement technology is coming, of course, the carbon tax becomes much better, right? A much better solution. And so abatement, kind of in combining carbon taxes with investment in abatement technology, but this argues that that's very important. The other policy, the clean energy subsidy, on the other hand, just doesn't do much here in this framework. And the reason is that it increases the consumption of energy as well. So it substitutes the word clean energy, but also increases total consumption of energy. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't affect CO2 emissions that much, and it doesn't affect global temperatures that much, even though it does affect the economy, like a subsidy on production. And so that actually leads, because there's a lack of investments, there's investment is not at its optimal level in this framework. The subsidy is a good thing for the economy, but for the wrong reasons, in the sense that it doesn't really affect temperature or CO2 emissions. So it's not effective in combating climate change. In particular, it's good for the economy. Okay, so that's all I have today, and so happy to answer all, or keep the discussion going. As I emphasized before, I think the main effect, kind of one of the take-home effects, is huge inequality of the effects in the range of 30%, and particularly affecting the poor world, which is perhaps a concern, and it also the importance of adaptation mechanisms, particularly migration.
Could I ask a question, a hypothetical question from the left? A lot of people who talk about climate these days they've given up on warming because they recognize warming just isn't that much of a problem. But they talk about extremes of weather and fires and floods and hurricanes and so on and so forth. Now, I don't think you have that in the model. You may say that's not scientifically supported at all, or you may have a different comment about, because that's right. Also one of the things that's supposed to differentially affect places. Things that are underwater, if they don't build dikes, have a much worse problem than places that don't.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. There's flooding and permanent inundation, and the effects of sea level rise more generally. That seems like an issue. We've evaluated that in similar models like this. That gives you maybe another 0.5% from the 6% that this gives you. So that's relatively minor. And then there is the episodic part, so the hurricanes, etc. That in principle you can incorporate. is not going to be that different than the flooding because it affects mostly the same regions. So, but in principle, you can incorporate a stochastic model of that. It's less of a go to the scientific literature and let me grab them all and plug it in. So it's a little bit harder to do in that sense. And so, you know, less people have done it, including us.
So
can be done.
We're just about out of time. One thing I'd say, many of the questions are more robustness questions. What if you change this? What if you do that? And one of the nice things about Esteban, who said at the beginning, this is all accessible, the model, the techniques. So go to his website and do your own changes and see what happens. I think that's the best way to answer some of the questions. But Esteban, thank you so much. This is so enlightening and such an impressive project. We had to lose a few people early, like Jim Sweeney, who commented, this is great stuff. So thank you so much.